In just 47 seconds, $3.6 million in community development contracts vanished from New York City's housing database. Zohran Mamdani didn't adjust his glasses or wait for the speaker's permission. He lifted a manila folder, tapped the red tab labeled District 36, and began to read. Cameras swiveled. The Albany chamber went dead silent. What did the socialist from Queens just uckant that made the most powerful real estate donors in New York politics stop smiling and start whispering? At exactly 9:07 a.m. on November 14, 2025, Assembly member Zohran Mamdani walked into the hearing room like a tenant organizer who had memorized every broken promise. His weathered leather satchel contained 3 months of forensic accounting, a stack of FOIA requests, and one explosive email chain that would detonate the cozy relationship between Albany and luxury developers. The mahogany-paneled chamber buzzed with the typical pre-hearing energy. Legislative aides shuffling papers, reporters checking their recording equipment, and lobbyists in $3,000 suits whispering last-minute talking points. But there was something different in the air today. Word had leaked that Mamdani had requested specific documents. The kind of documents that made wealthy donors nervous. Across the mahogany table sat Speaker Carl Heastie, flanked by Assemblyman Stephen Simbrowitz, a career politician who had carved his legacy from affordable housing rhetoric, while his campaign coffers swelled with developer gold. Simbrowitz adjusted his flag pin and forced a practiced smile, the same expression he wore at ribbon cuttings and press conferences. He looked like a man who had spent 40 years perfecting the art of saying everything while revealing nothing. Behind him, 3 lobbyists from the Real Estate Board of New York sat in the gallery, their faces masks of professional concern. They had been tracking Mamdani's FOIA requests for weeks. They knew he was hunting something big. Assemblyman Mamdani, Simbrowitz began, his voice dripping with patronizing authority. I hope we can keep today's discussion focused on practical solutions for working families. Zohran's pen stopped moving. His eyes locked onto Simbrowitz with surgical precision. Working families. That's exactly what I want to discuss. The first rehook hit like a silent alarm. At 9:09 a.m., Zohran opened his folder with deliberate care. Inside were photocopied bank transfers, email printouts with yellow highlighter bleeding through the pages, and a single USB drive that contained recordings no politician wanted the public to hear. Assemblyman Simbrowitz, you've been very vocal about supporting affordable housing in District 36. Your press releases mention a $3.6 million allocation for community outreach and tenant services. Zohran's voice carried the calm authority of someone who had done his homework. Can you tell us which specific organization received those funds? The question hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Every person in the gallery understood they were witnessing something unprecedented. A state assemblyman calling out another assemblyman in public session wasn't just unusual, it was career-threatening. Simbrowitz's smile flickered like a neon sign, losing power. His aide, a nervous young man in an ill-fitting suit, leaned in to whisper something urgent. The aide's hand trembled slightly as he passed a sticky note across the table. That allocation, Simbrowitz said, clearing his throat and buying time by taking a long sip of water, supports multiple community partners. The details are all in the public record. A reporter from the Daily News leaned forward, sensing blood in the water. In the gallery, a woman holding a Housing Justice Now sign exchanged knowing looks with the man beside her. Are they? Zohran's pen tapped once against his notepad, a sound that echoed like a judge's gavel in the suddenly silent room. Because according to the New York State Comptroller's database, those funds were transferred to Emerald City Consulting on August 15th. One payment, one recipient, no competitive bidding. The chamber's temperature seemed to drop 5 degrees. You could hear the hum of the overhead lights. Simbrowitz's jaw tightened. His hands gripped the edge of his folder until his knuckles went white. I don't appreciate these baseless insinuations, Assemblyman. Emerald City provides vital services. Emerald City Consulting, Zohran interrupted, pulling out a second document, whose registered address is a mailbox in Midtown Manhattan, whose only listed employee is Marcus Steinberg, the same Marcus Steinberg who donated $275,000 to your campaign last year through 3 separate PACs. A reporter in the gallery leaned forward. Another lifted her phone to start recording. The second rehook landed with the force of a sledgehammer. Speaker Heasty cleared his throat. Assemblyman Mamdani, these hearings are meant to address policy, not engage in character assassination. Zohran's stare never wavered from Simbrowitz. Mr. Speaker, with respect, I'm reading from public documents. If the truth feels like an assassination, perhaps we need to examine why. The room erupted in whispers. A camera flash went off. Simbrowitz's face drained of color as Zohran reached for a third document. This one thicker, bound with a black binder clip. At 9:12 a.m., the real bombshell dropped. This is an email chain, Zohran announced, lifting a document that looked like it had been handled by a dozen different investigators, between Assemblyman Simbrowitz's chief of staff and Pinnacle Development Group. The subject line reads, Zoning Variance Approval Timeline, Expedited Track. His voice carried across the silent chamber like a funeral bell. The date is September 3, 2025, 2 weeks before the Astoria Towers project was fast-tracked through planning review. The implications hit the room like a physical wave. Several reporters started typing frantically. A lobbyist in the gallery pulled out his phone and began texting urgent messages to someone, probably his clients, warning them that the walls were closing in. Simbrowitz shot to his feet so fast, his chair rolled backward and hit the wall behind him. Those communications are filled. These emails, Zohran continued, his voice rising above the interruption like a prosecutor delivering closing arguments, discuss a $410 million luxury development in my district. 47% luxury units. 0 affordable housing. But here's the fascinating part. He lifted a single page, holding it up for the cameras like evidence in a murder trial. The paper shook slightly, not from nervousness, but from the controlled fury of a man who had watched his constituents suffer while politicians got rich. Pinnacle Development's managing partner, David Morrison, is also the majority owner of Emerald City Consulting. The silence in the room was so complete you could hear someone's stomach growl 3 rows back. A camera operator adjusted his lens to capture Simbrowitz's face, which had gone from red to white to a sickly green shade. A reporter's pen clattered to the floor like a gunshot in a library. Speaker Heasty's aide frantically scribbled notes, probably calculating which campaign donors to call first. Simbrowitz remained standing, frozen like a deer in headlights, his face cycling through expressions of rage, panic, and desperate calculation. You want to know where that $3.6 million went? Zohran's voice cut through the tension like a blade. It didn't fund tenant services. It didn't support affordable housing. It was a consulting fee, a payment to the same company that's gentrifying Queens families out of their homes. The third rehook detonated like a political IED. At 9:15 a.m., Zohran wasn't finished. He pulled out his phone, set it on the table, and pressed play. This is a recording of a conversation between David Morrison and an unidentified city planning official. Recorded on September. Morrison's voice crackled through the phone speaker. Carl's guy says the vote is locked up. 3.6 gets us clean approval. No community board hassle. No affordable housing requirements. We're golden. The unidentified voice responded. And if the socialist from Queens starts asking questions? Morrison's laugh was cold and dismissive. What's he gonna do? He's one vote. Simbrowitz owns that committee. The recording stopped. The chamber was a tomb. Simbrowitz collapsed back into his chair like a man who had just watched his career evaporate in real time. Sweat traced down his temple despite the air conditioning. His aide was typing frantically on his laptop, probably drafting a resignation letter or calculating which reporters to call first. Speaker Heasty's face was stone, but his eyes were calculating political damage control, wondering how much of this stench would stick to the entire Democratic caucus. A camera operator zoomed in on Simbrowitz's trembling hands. In the gallery, a housing activist from Jackson Heights started a slow clap that rippled through the room until it became thunderous applause. Security moved to quiet them, but Heasty waved them off. He understood political theater, and this was Zohran's moment. The fourth and final rehook wasn't just a revelation, it was a political execution broadcast live on Assemblyman Simbrowitz, Zohran said, his voice now quiet and deadly. You've spent 15 years telling working families that affordable housing is your priority. But this evidence shows you've been taking money from the very developers displacing those families. Simbrowitz's voice cracked when he finally spoke. These are taken out of context. The allocation process is complex. The allocation process, Zohran interrupted, standing now and walking slowly toward the witness table, is corruption. $3.6 million. That's 150 families who could have stayed in their homes. That's 300 children who didn't have to change schools mid-semester because their parents got priced out. He stopped directly in front of Simbrowitz, close enough to see the perspiration on his forehead. And you want to tell me that's complex? A reporter in the back row whispered into her phone, "This is unprecedented. I've never seen anything like this in Albany." Simbrowitz tried one last desperate deflection. "Assemblyman, surely you understand that economic development requires partnership with the private sector." Partnership? Zohran's eyebrows shot up. His voice carried a note of genuine incredulity. You call taking bribes partnership? You call selling out your constituents' economic development? He gestured to the gallery filled with housing advocates. These people aren't your partners. They're the families you betrayed. The silence stretched for 7 full seconds, an eternity in political time. When Simbrowitz finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "I resign from the Housing Committee, effective immediately." But Zohran wasn't done. Resignation isn't accountability. The people of Queens deserve justice, not just your convenient exit. At 9:17 a.m., 3 minutes before the session was supposed to end, Simbrowitz's political career effectively died. The aftermath was swift and brutal. By noon, Simbrowitz Gate was trending on Twitter. Cable news picked up the story within the hour. CNN's Chiron read, "Corruption exposed. NY Assemblyman takes developer cash while families lose home." Fox News, surprisingly, led with socialist lawmaker uncovers housing scandal. When will Albany clean house? By 2 p.m., Governor Kathy Hochul's office issued a statement calling for a full investigation into all housing allocation procedures. The state attorney general's office announced they were reviewing the matter with utmost seriousness. 3 more Democratic assemblymen quietly returned donations from Pinnacle Development Group. But the real earthquake came at 4:47 p.m. when the FBI's Public Corruption Unit served search warrants at both Simbrowitz's Albany office and Emerald City Consulting's Manhattan mailbox. Federal prosecutors had been building a case for months. Zohran's public exposure just gave them the political cover they needed to move. The FBI opened a preliminary inquiry by Friday. Simbrowitz hired a criminal defense attorney by Monday. Yet for Zohran, this was never about one corrupt assemblyman. Standing outside the Capitol steps as reporters shouted questions, he looked directly into the cameras. This isn't just about Steve Simbrowitz. This is about a system so rotten that $3.6 million can disappear into a shell company while working families in Queens get evicted from homes their grandparents built. A reporter called out, "Assemblyman, what's next? Are there more investigations coming?" Zohran's smile was grim and determined. "I've got 17 more folders just like this one. And I'm just getting started." But the real story wasn't about one corrupt assemblyman. It was about a system so broken that $3.6 million could disappear into a shell company while families in Queens got evicted from their homes. The ripple effects spread like wildfire through Albany's political ecosystem. Within days, 3 other assemblymen quietly returned suspicious donations. The State Ethics Commission announced new disclosure requirements. Editorial boards across New York demanded comprehensive reform of the housing allocation process. 2 weeks later, Zohran sat in his cramped Astoria office, reviewing another folder marked Bronx Housing Authority, Discrepancies. His desk was covered with similar folders: Brooklyn Development Irregularities, Manhattan Rezoning Conflicts, Staten Island Contract Questions. Each one represented months of investigation, hundreds of FOIA requests, and countless late nights connecting financial dots. His phone buzzed constantly with interview requests, but he ignored most of them. CNN wanted him for a panel discussion. The Daily Show had called twice, A publisher was interested in a book deal about corruption in Albany. But there was more work to do. On his computer screen, an email notification popped up from a whistleblower in the Department of Housing Preservation and Development. The subject line read, "You need to see this. Bigger than Simbrowitz." Attached were bank records showing a web of shell companies, each one connected to a different assemblyman, each one receiving millions in consulting fees from the same development firms. Zohran opened the email and began to read. His expression shifted from interest to concern to grim determination. He reached for his phone and dialed a number he'd memorized. "It's Mamdani. I need to schedule another hearing. And this time, we're going to need a bigger room. The oldest lesson is always the truest. Sunlight remains the best disinfectant. And in a system built on shadows and silence, sometimes the most powerful weapon is simply the truth, archived and revealed at the right second. Sometimes the strongest weapon isn't a subpoena or a federal investigation. It's truth, documented and delivered by someone who refuses to look the other way. What happens when a politician who built power on backroom deals meets a representative who believes transparency isn't negotiable? What happens when affordable housing rhetoric collides with inconvenient bank records? And what happens when one voice refuses to stay quiet, even when the entire system wants silence? If this story reminds you why documentation matters, why oversight isn't optional, and why some fights are worth having regardless of the odds, like, share, and subscribe to keep following the money. Hit the notification bell. The next corruption scandal might be happening in your district. What would you do if you had evidence this explosive sitting on your desk? Would you pull the trigger knowing it might end a career, or would you find a way to work within the system? Drop your answer below, because in politics, silence isn't neutrality, it's complicity. This dramatized story explores themes of corruption, accountability, and the power of transparency in democratic institutions. All dialogue and specific incidents are fictionalized for educational and commentary purposes. This content is not intended to defame any real individuals, but to examine the dynamics of power, money, and political responsibility in contemporary American politics.